very much. Well, I should say, first of all, happy Thanksgiving. There must be some Americans here. I feel obliged, given the occasion. Thanksgiving it's not the most important American holiday, it's the most American holiday. It's uniquely American. It's not celebrated anywhere else in the world. As you know, it supposedly originated with the Pilgrims, although that is disputed by some who come from my native state of Virginia, that it was the first celebration of settlers who came to the United States. I suppose this may not work, but for many years at CNN, where I was there for 20 years, I would tell my annual Thanksgiving joke. Now, it may not work with people who are not familiar with Thanksgiving. As you know, on Thanksgiving, basically it's a holiday about eating. And Americans eat a large turkey, which is usually served on an enormous platter, and it's a big family occasion. And the story I would always tell on CNN, and I will share it with you if you haven't heard it before, is what 3 national disasters would be caused if you dropped the Thanksgiving platter? The answer is the downfall of Turkey, the breakup of China, and the overthrow of Greece. I give that to you on this occasion. As was indicated, I've been in this business a while. King made me appear rather old there, an older generation of journalists who try to go down the middle. I'm a political analyst. I've been around quite a while, as I said, and I thought I had seen everything until 2008. And I saw Sarah Palin, and I said, this is new. This is something I have never seen before. And we may be seeing more. Well, if you followed American politics, you know that earlier this month we had a very dramatic midterm election in which the Obama administration and the Democrats had a very serious setback. And the question on a lot of people's minds is very simply what went wrong. 2 years ago, Barack Obama took office amid a wave of hope and optimism following 8 years of Bush's deeply unpopular war in Iraq and a near catastrophic financial crisis. What went wrong? How did all this change in 2 years? Well, what I would point out to you is that the United States Constitution, unique in all the world, specifies that the President of the United States is Commander-in-Chief of the military. He or she, potentially, has military rank. He's literally a member of the military, and he's the superior officer to the entire military establishment of the United States. No other country has that. Americans also behave as if the president is the commander-in-chief of the economy. Well, he's not. Who's commander-in-chief of the American economy? Nobody. Not the president, not the chairman of the Federal Reserve. It is a huge economy. It is extremely complex, and it cannot be commanded to do anything, even though Americans like to believe that the president is in charge. The economy is just too big. But if the economy is faltering, voters believe the president is not doing his job. Or if the economy is doing very well, then they're very happy with the president. That's why Bill Clinton got through the impeachment saga back in the 1990s. The economy was booming in 1998 and 1999, and most Americans said, why are they bothering the president? Let him alone. He's doing his job. So a good economy can save you, and a bad economy can create serious problems. The first thing I should tell you about the United States, and if you've ever lived there or been there, you may know this. In my view, the United States of America is the most populist country in the world. Next to the United States, the rest of the world is Saudi Arabia. The populist impulse is pervasive. You see it in very big ways in the importance of public opinion. We poll everybody on everything all the time. And one of the things I did for CNN for many years was report public opinion polls, which are very important in the United States. But you also see the influence of American populism in some small ways, like this. The government of the United States has warehouses filled with dollar coins that look like euro coins. They've minted 3 different versions of them, and they're all stored in warehouses for a simple reason. The American people will not use them. They only will trust paper money. So the government has minted about 1 billion of these dollar coins, but no one will use them because they won't be told they have to use dollar coins, and they won't do it. Elites in other countries will tell their people that they must use the metric system because it is scientific and rational. Good luck trying to get Americans to convert to the metric system. They simply refuse to take direction from experts. The United States, 90% of jury trials in the world take place in the United States because we trust the wisdom of ordinary people, and we rely on juries much more than any other country. We are the only country in the world that elects judges. Not all judges, but in many states, judges are elected, and they have to stand for re-election, and they are thrown out. This year, one of the dramatic results in the election that you may not have seen is that the state of Iowa is one of 5 states in the United States where same-sex marriages are now legal. That was a decision made about 2 years ago by the state Supreme Court of Iowa, and a lot of people resisted that. It is the law in Iowa. But this year, 3 of the judges, it was a unanimous decision on the court, 3 of the judges were on the ballot for reconfirmation to the court. And they were all defeated. They were all thrown off the court because so many people disapproved of that decision, which of course remains. In Europe, people may favor the death penalty, but elites will tell them that capital punishment is cruel and barbaric and it has to be outlawed. You can't join the European Union if you have the death penalty. When George W. Bush made his first presidential visit to Europe in the spring of 2001, he faced protests against the death penalty in the United States. The Oklahoma City bomber, Timothy McVeigh, had just been executed. And he was asked about his support for the death penalty at a press conference in Madrid. And he said, quote, "Democracies represent the will of the people. The death penalty is the will of the people in the United States," unquote. It is. And you cannot defy the will of the people in the United States with impunity. The people rule. You know, I'm reminded there's a famous story of a longtime state legislator in the United States who had served in office for decades. This was about 100 years ago. And after all this service, he finally faced defeat in a primary. And he went before his supporters on election night, and he looked at them very gravely, and he said, "The people have spoken. God bless the people. The rotten, filthy bastards." You might have heard that from a few politicians as recently as last week. Now, I mention American populism because that is a criticism one often hears of President Obama, that he doesn't have a populist bone in his body. In the campaign in 2008, he was the progressive Democrat. Hillary Clinton was really the populist Democrat, and she did very well with white working-class voters all over the country. President Obama's problem, I think, is that he strikes a lot of voters as something of an elitist. Elitist is exactly the opposite of a populist. He is a prince of the meritocracy, brilliant, well-educated, high-achieving, and cool. He has a deep confidence in rational problem-solving. Lay out all the facts and reasonable people will come to agreement. The problem is, politics is not often about rationality. It is often deeply irrational. And that elitist temperament, trust us, we know what we're doing, it sometimes surfaces in unguarded moments. Most recently when he was asked about the proposal to build a Muslim center, which most people assume to be a mosque, because it does have a religious function, a mosque in New York City near the site of Ground Zero, the attacks on September 11th, 2001. And he gave the legally correct answer, legally correct, which is Americans have the right to worship anywhere they please under the Constitution. But that answer put him out of touch, I think, with a lot of ordinary Americans, because in the popular view, the issue was not whether Muslims have a constitutional right to worship wherever they want. Of course they do. No one disputes that. The issue was whether putting this religious center so close to Ground Zero showed the proper sensitivity and respect to those who had suffered on September 11th, 2001. President Bill Clinton exuded empathy. He was a real populist, still is. He communicated and connected with Americans who were hurting on a deeply personal level. The joke became, but this was very serious during his presidency, Clinton felt your pain. Now Americans are hurting again because of the economy, and it is sometimes difficult for President Obama to make that kind of emotional connection. And that's one reason why we saw a wave of Clinton nostalgia in the United States this year. Bill Clinton campaigned around the country for Democrats. He went to states like Kentucky and West Virginia, where President Obama is very unpopular, and he tried to rally the Democratic supporters to their party. He was widely admired, very popular. He couldn't save the party, although Democrats did hold on in a number of important states like California, Nevada, and in other places in the United States. What this president, Obama, had to contend with, of course, you've all read about, you may find it a little bit mysterious, this thing called the Tea Party movement. The Tea Party movement is, of course, anti-government. All Republicans and all conservatives in the United States are anti-government, but it's also anti-politics. They believe that politics is essentially corrupt, that deal-making and compromise are an abandonment of principle. I think the Tea Party represents what I would call political fundamentalism, very much similar to religious fundamentalism. Like religious fundamentalists, Tea Party activists root out heretics, like the governor of Florida, who was driven out of his party because he had embraced President Obama. They do not tolerate waverers, like the Republican congressman from the state of Delaware, who's defeated, a former governor. He was defeated in his own party primary because he had wavered from the conservative faith. And they believe in the total inerrancy of Scripture. In this case, Scripture is not the Holy Bible, but the United States Constitution as it was originally written in 1787. And like a religious group, the Tea Party movement also has an antichrist. The Antichrist is President Obama. New Republicans were elected to Congress with the mandate to stop President Obama's policies and reverse them wherever possible. And I fear that while Americans may believe they voted for compromise and moderation by electing a Democratic president and a Republican-controlled House of Representatives, what they want is moderation. What they're likely to get, unfortunately, is gridlock. Because the parties have moved very far apart. That the polarization of American politics is very, very deep for reasons I'll explain in just a moment. Interestingly, I should point out the Tea Party emerged just within weeks of Obama's taking office. A lot of people wondered, did Obama's race, the fact that he's African American, have anything to do with it? For some, possibly it did. But the eruption of anger seemed bigger to me and broader than racism. It did not originate in, and it's not confined to the racist backwaters of American society. So I would say while there is some element of racism in some of the Tea Party opposition, it is in fact much broader, and what their anger is really focused on is not racial issues, but the threat, the specter of big government, which Americans have always been fearful of since the founding of the Republic. Americans didn't vote for anything this year. They didn't vote for Republicans. The Republican Party has a more negative image than the Democratic Party. And they didn't vote for the Tea Party. Only 20% of Americans expressed a favorable view of the Tea Party. They were voting against the Democratic Congress and against the Democrats in general because the view was they're not doing their job. The economy is terrible. And that effectively was a vote to punish them. When Republicans took control of Congress in 1995, after 2 years of Bill Clinton, they tried the path of obstruction for a year. And that ended in a train wreck. The government was shut down. And eventually, President Clinton and the Republican Congress figured out a way to work together. And a lot of people are hopeful now that President Obama will be able to work with the Republican Congress. The question is, will the Republican Congress be willing to work with him? You know, that we've had decades and decades now in the United States of polarization, and it's become very bitter and very ugly. What drove the hatred of Bill Clinton back in the 1990s was interesting. It wasn't really disagreement on policy. He and the Republicans agreed on many very, very important policies. And everything that Bill Clinton achieved as president, he achieved with Republican support. He agreed with Republicans and they supported him on free trade. NAFTA was not passed by Democrats, it was passed by Republicans, the free trade agreement with Canada and Mexico. The balanced budget was supported by Republicans. Democrats were horrified when Clinton proposed balancing the budget. Welfare reform, which is a policy Democrats had serious doubts about, he passed with Republican support. There wasn't a policy disagreement between Clinton and the Republicans. There was a disagreement over values. Conservatives hated Clinton because of his values. He was the first and so far the only president to come out of the liberal culture of the 1960s. That's very important. Clinton once said, and this is the key to the polarization of American politics, if you lived through the 1960s and you believe they did more good than harm, you're a Democrat. If you believe that the 1960s did more harm than good, you are a Republican. That's about it. It's Bill Clinton and George W. Bush. Two figures of the same generation, but polar opposites in cultural values. And that division endures in American society. I like to point out that in the 1960s, China experienced the great proletarian cultural revolution. They got over it. The United States experienced the great American cultural revolution, and we're still fighting it. We can't get over it, even though the Chinese was far more traumatic. What drove Clinton hatred? I remember during the impeachment story, I went to Chicago and interviewed a leading conservative activist and asked him a simple question. I said, why do you hate Bill Clinton so much? And he got very agitated and red in the face, and he started pounding the table. He said, why do I hate Bill Clinton? Because he's a womanizing, Elvis-loving, truth-shading, non-inhaling, draft-dodging, war-protesting, abortion-promoting, gay-protecting, gun-hating baby boomer. I see, I said. It's not the policies, it's the values. And he said, you're damn right. I hate him because he has all the wrong values, un-American. He was a child of the 1960s. So the Congress supported, the Republican Congress supported President Clinton's policies, and then they turned around and impeached him. In Obama's case, it really is different. He is not exactly a child of the 1960s. He's too young for that. In fact, I have a quote in his book, The Audacity of Hope. He wrote, quote, we have to move beyond the psychodrama of the baby boom generation, a tale of grudges and revenge plots hatched on a handful of college campuses long ago. He was elected to bridge divides. He's biracial. He can speak the language of faith, which many Democrats are not fully comfortable with. He's of a newer generation. He is multicultural. He got a lot of votes from minorities, not just African Americans, but also Latinos voted for him heavily. And there was some question about whether Hispanic Americans would vote for an African American. And they did. There was just no problem with that. In Obama's case, it really is the policies that people disagree, that conservatives disagree with. They hate what I would call his free spending, high taxing, over-regulating, bailout pandering, healthcare reforming, government enhancing, freedom diminishing, enterprise killing socialist policies. And they ain't going to collaborate with those policies. Collaboration to the new conservative activists, collaboration with those policies means selling out. So they're going to pressure Republican leaders to shun unbelievers like Obama and Democrats generally, to stand on principle, to reject deals with the Antichrist. And you know, Congress is led by professional politicians. Politicians make deals. They compromise. When the Tea Party movement says what they want to do is change Washington, what they mean is they want to get rid of the politics. And that's going to be dangerous, and that's going to be very interesting to see how it comes out. I should point out that the division, which I've located, is beginning really in the 1960s. It's very bitter. Americans don't like it, and it's become an issue in and of itself. The last 4 presidents of the United States were elected to bring the country together. They all were sincere, I think, in their intentions. They all failed. The first President Bush promised a kinder, gentler America. but his presidency only lasted one term. Bill Clinton was elected as a new Democrat who supported the third way, trying to bridge the gap between Democrats and Republicans. But the country, for reasons I've explained, became bitterly divided over his values. The second President Bush, believe it or not, he was elected the very first day he declared his candidacy for president. He said, I'm going to be a uniter, not a divider. A uniter, not a divider. What he did was take a country that was bitterly divided under Bill Clinton, and he divided it even more. And of course, Barack Obama was elected to heal the division. He famously, when he was his first great speech at the Democratic Convention in 2004, he said, there is no red America, there's no blue America, there is only the United States of America. And people were very hopeful, given his background and his standing, that he finally, after so many years, could heal this division. And look what's happened. It's become even more bitter than it ever was. And it's not because of Obama, I don't think. It's because these differences are very deep. I'm often asked, what will it take to end the polarization of American politics? I used to say it would take a great trauma. Well, we had one, 9/11. And for 1 year after 9/11, the United States was basically united. Democrats don't believe me, but the fact is, most Democrats supported President Bush for 1 year, until September 2002, when he began what he called the rollout of the Iraq War. And then, of course, everything became even more bitter than ever. Would it take a great charismatic leader? That's President Obama. People had high hopes for him that he could bridge this divide. But so far it hasn't happened. It's too early to judge in his presidency, which could be 1 or 2 terms. It's too early to judge. But the fact is, even he, with all his rhetorical skill, has failed to bridge that divide. My guess is it may take the passing of that baby boom generation that Bill Clinton talked about. It took a passing of a generation after the Civil War of the 1860s to bridge the North-South divide in the United States. It may take the passing of my generation, the baby boom generation in the United States, to bridge the divide between liberals and conservatives. It's a very difficult time in the United States. And a lot of people are wondering, where can we go from here? What can happen next? Well, I can tell you this. The 2012 campaign has already started. It takes 2 years to run a presidential campaign in the United States. We're in the phase of the next presidential campaign called the invisible primary, where nobody votes, but the candidates compete to see who can raise the most money and who can end up at the top of the polls. That will be, the invisible primary ends in December 2011, when we find out who's raised the most money and who's number 1 in the polls of Republicans. Some people have asked, with President Obama doing badly in the midterm election, is it possible that a Democrat could emerge to challenge President Obama for renomination as a Democrat? Well, I don't think so, for 2 reasons. One is, no one has ever successfully challenged a president in his own party. Eugene McCarthy did not quite defeat Lyndon Johnson in New Hampshire. Johnson probably would have gone on to get the Democratic nomination. His vice president, Hubert Humphrey, eventually did. And we don't know what would have happened if Robert Kennedy had not been murdered. But it didn't, in 1968, despite the division of the country, Lyndon Johnson, I think, probably would have been renominated. Ronald Reagan challenged Gerald Ford in 1976, an unelected Republican president. He couldn't do it. Ronald Reagan couldn't do it. It's the only election he ever lost. And in 1980, Edward Kennedy challenged Jimmy Carter, a very unpopular Democratic president. And he couldn't do it either. So it's very unlikely that anyone can challenge a president in his own party. But the particular reason why I think very few people, if anyone, are likely to try is that it would be deeply, deeply offensive to African Americans if a Democrat emerged to challenge President Obama. They would take it as a slight, and whoever the Democrat was who did that would become an enemy to African Americans. They are the base of the Democratic Party. They vote Democratic consistently. A politician, a very wise politician once said, your base, you have to have a base in politics. Your base are the people who are with you when you're wrong. Bill Clinton had a base. They stuck with him during the impeachment. Ronald Reagan had a base. They stuck with him during the Iran-Contra hearings. And I think President Obama certainly has a base, clearly African Americans. And anyone who challenges Obama in the Democratic Party would instantly be seen as an enemy of the African American community, and that is no way to get the Democratic nomination. So I think he'll be renominated. I'm pretty sure he will be if he chooses to run again, and there's every indication that he will. What about the Republicans? Everyone wants to know who's at the lead right now. Well, there's a pattern that I've observed over many years. In the Republican Party, they usually nominate someone who has run before. Richard Nixon had run before. Ronald Reagan had run before. John McCain had run before. Bob Dole had run before. The first President Bush had run before. George W. Bush, his son, had not run before, but his name was Bush, so people thought he had run before. Democrats don't do that. Democrats like to pluck people out of obscurity, like Jimmy Carter from Plains, Georgia. That's obscure. Michael Dukakis, a relatively unknown governor of Massachusetts. Bill Clinton, governor of Arkansas. Most people didn't know anything about him. Barack Obama, who was just 2 years a senator when he started running for president. Democrats pluck people out of obscurity. The saying in the United States is, Democrats fall in love, Republicans fall in line. If they do that, then the leading candidate for the Republican nomination would be Mitt Romney, who ran in 2008 and didn't get the nomination. He is the candidate who is at the top of the polls right now, but there is some resistance to him among conservatives because he was one of the sponsors of health care reform in Massachusetts. He signed health care reform, and that is a curse word to conservatives these days because the Massachusetts plan was a model for the federal plan. And he has wavered on a lot of conservative issues. He once supported abortion rights, no more. He once supported gay rights, no more. But conservatives just don't trust him. I've always argued that political correctness is a bigger problem in the United States on the right than on the left. If anyone wanders from the true faith of conservative principles in the United States, the conservatives will not tolerate that. Liberals have a problem too, but it's not nearly as severe or as punitive as conservatives are. So Romney is a controversial candidate. He's also a Mormon, which creates some problems, I think, in the Republican primaries because a lot of evangelical Christians don't really want to vote for a Mormon, and he didn't do particularly well in the Southern Republican primaries. A lot of evangelical Christians consider Mormonism a heretical Christian sect. So he might have problems as a Republican candidate. What about Sarah Palin? She appears to be running for president. It's certainly good for business in her case, because as long as she continues to look like she might run for president, she's invited to give speeches. She is a media phenomenon. People vote for her daughter as a dancer on a television show, Dancing with the Stars. She lasted until the very end of that show. She has a devoted and fierce following. The problem with her, of course, is most Americans do not think she's qualified to be president. In fact, most of her supporters do not think she's qualified to be president. And it would not be easy to see her get elected. She does, of course, have a following. A lot of people say, well, to imagine Sarah Palin as president of the United States, that would be absurd. But I bring you a famous quote from a political leader who said, in politics, absurdity is not a handicap. That was said by Napoleon Bonaparte 200 years ago. And it is not. I mean, stranger things have happened, and my conclusion after observing politics in the United States for many, many years is that just about anybody can get elected under the right circumstances. And the right circumstances for Sarah Palin would have to be a country that is very angry and very, very, very desperate. The conservative Republican establishment is very worried about the prospect of her nomination, and so they are trying to find a champion who can oppose her. Mitt Romney is one possibility. They're also looking at some other Republicans I'm sure you've never heard of. The governor of New Jersey, Chris Christie, John Thune, Tim Pawlenty. There are many others that they are looking at because they want to find someone who will be a strong candidate and resist the populist appeal of former Governor Palin. I would say that it could get very interesting. If she were to run and look like she were about to get the Republican nomination, and Obama, if he is in as much trouble 2 years from now as he is now, then I might imagine a third-party candidate or an independent candidate would run for president. It takes money to do that. Ross Perot had money, and he did that. And he got 19% of the vote, which was a record. Well, he came in second. The record for a third-party candidate was a former president, Theodore Roosevelt, when he ran for president the second time. But Perot did very well. There is one guy with a lot of money. He's the mayor of New York, Michael Bloomberg, and he has positioned himself as the chief critic of the Tea Party in the last campaign. I think he would see himself as someone who could save the country. He's got $20 billion. $20 billion. That's a lot of money, and much more than enough to run for president of the United States. So it wouldn't be surprising if we suddenly saw some very strange and unusual things happening in American politics. You know, Harold Wilson, the great Prime Minister of Britain, once said, "A week is a long time in politics. 2 years, therefore, is an eternity in politics." It is impossible to make any kind of confident predictions. But I can only promise you one thing. It will be very, very interesting. Thank you very much.
Questions from the audience members. If you could stand up and identify yourself, and Dr. Schneider will take the questions himself.
Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Sarah Palin from University.
I've met you.
I have met you too. Way back when in Ann Arbor. I wonder why you didn't mention anything about the role of the media in the current development of divisiveness in America. And you mentioned briefly the change in the media. But what role do you think media did play in the way things have been developing over the last few years?
I think the media probably exasperated the division in American, exacerbated the division in American politics, because today, to quote famous journalist Ted Koppel, who said, "Today we have news you can choose." And people choose to watch television networks that they agree with, whether it's Fox on the right or MSNBC on the left. They look at the blogosphere, and there are plenty of bloggers on the right and left who just reinforce their opinions. This is not particularly new. Historically, in every country, newspapers were often very partisan and usually very, very shrill. I remember many years ago covering an election in Britain, and that was in 1974, when Ted Heath was prime minister, and the election was inconclusive, and he stayed in office for a few days. And there was a labor newspaper that had a blaring headline, "For the love of God, go." This kind of shrill partisanship is not unusual. But it was missing in our media for most of the period after World War II. That was an unusual period when we had mass media, 3 television networks, major newspapers that were very much nonpartisan. And what some creative entrepreneurs discovered in the 1980s was there is an audience out there, there's a market for news presented, information, journalism, presented from a point of view. There always has been. The market has always been there. They just found out, America is a great entrepreneurial country. In an entrepreneurial country, capitalism, where there is a market, there will be a product. Okay, that's how capitalism works. There was a market, and some people figured it out. There's a market among conservatives for news presented from a conservative point of view. So they invented a network that delivered that. And liberals then discovered there's also a market for news delivered from a liberal point of view. And I think all of that has exasperated the division in American politics. But let me also cite a book which I greatly admire by a journalist from Texas, Bill Bishop, who wrote a book called The Big Sort. And in his book, he pointed something interesting out. That in the United States over the last 30 years, Americans have become more and more segregated by politics. Not by race, but by politics. And he shows statistically how in he does 2004 compared to 1976, more and more Americans live in places that vote overwhelmingly Democratic or Republican. That is, they live among people who share their politics. How did that happen? Well, principally because when Americans move to a place, they want to be in a place that shares their lifestyle. And today, politics, more than in the past, reflects people's lifestyle. It's a politics of values, much more than interests. So people will move to a community because it has deep religious values, and they belong to churches. I spent some time after the 2000 election in Kennesaw, Georgia, just outside of Atlanta, a very conservative community. It became famous in the United States because it has a law on the books that requires every household to maintain a firearm in good working order. That's by law. You can be fined. So I went there and I discovered that in Kennesaw, Georgia, life revolves around churches. Everyone knows what parish they and everyone else belongs to, and churches are the center of their life because America is still a very religious society. I then spent a week in Bethesda, Maryland, which is the best educated place in the United States. It's the National Institutes of Health outside of Washington. It has more lawyers and doctors and professional people than anywhere. All the cars have Harvard and Yale stickers on them. And it's filled with foreign cars and art movie houses and interesting restaurants. And what I discovered there was the people in Bethesda, Maryland also have a deep and abiding faith, not so much in religion, but in education. They moved there because of the schools. Bethesda, Maryland voted 70% Democrat, and Kennesaw, Georgia voted 70% Republican. People didn't move there because of the politics, they moved there because of the lifestyle. That is what the 60s were all about. That is what the 60s were all about. And in particular, you might not be familiar with this, what was unusual about the American reaction to the 60s, because it happened here too. I mean, I visited Europe in the 60s and 70s. You had a great cultural revolution here and a lot of disruption. It happened all over Europe. But there was one thing unique about the United States. Only in the United States do we have a ferocious backlash to the cultural changes of the 60s. And that backlash, the conservative backlash, which sustained Nixon and Reagan and Bush and now the Tea Party, that really originated in something unique in America, and that is our religious culture. Today, if you want to find out how an American votes, Republican or Democrat, and you have one question, the easiest way to do that is to ask, how often do you go to church? Those who go to church regularly vote Republican. Those who don't go regularly vote Democratic. And that religious culture really formed the basis of a deep and abiding backlash to those cultural changes of the 1960s. So there is more segregation now than politics. I think that has as much to do with it. I don't think it's media driven, but I think the media have discovered something that was already there, namely this division in our political culture, and they decided, you know what, we can make money on this. And that's exactly what they did. Any other questions? Sir.
For me, the United States, since I'm now more than 60, is a very special country, and it developed worldwide as one of the powerhouses. So when I hear and speak about America, it's not so much USA, it's the United States of America, and that's something different. If I consider the economic power you had in the past, the military power you have right now, how long you can finance it, something else. If I realize that China's economy is growing, desperately growing, and if I realize that you promote, or you say the United States, the people are caring for values, I'm a bit confused, because if I see at the very moment the foreign affairs politics of the United States, I'm also confused, recognizing that the START agreement between Russia and the United States is got on hold just because out of ego or whatever reason. And this is not just a like or dislike, it affects the world. And here I would like to have your opinion how the future, the foreign affairs policy of the United States develops and affects us and the world.
Well, of course, the division I described in American politics does exist on foreign affairs. Much of it was revived after 9/11 by the division over the war in Iraq. And now the war in Afghanistan is as deeply unpopular as the war in Iraq was in 2006. If you talk to American voters, you often hear them ask, why are Americans fighting and dying to save a government that steals elections? That's a logical question, and it's difficult to answer that question. It's very complicated reasoning. I don't think foreign affairs are at the core, but the division over foreign affairs, Vietnam, now Iraq, potentially Afghanistan, is very serious. And I should point out that President Obama made a campaign promise that he would begin the withdrawal of American troops from Afghanistan in July 2011. He is under great pressure now from the Republicans in Congress and from the military in Afghanistan to postpone that date. That will be very difficult for him politically, because if he does, I think his own base, the liberal wing of the Democratic Party, will erupt in anger. They know that he did not deliver on some other campaign promises, like his promise to close Guantanamo. It's still open. It became very difficult to do. It's still open. If he postpones the withdrawal from Afghanistan, I think there will be a deep eruption of anger. Foreign affairs, it's very serious. You mentioned the START Treaty. My reading is that the Republicans in Congress have decided to delay, but not defeat, the ratification. They've decided to delay it principally for the reason you gave, politics. They wanted to show, we just want a mandate. We control Congress. We have to ratify this treaty. Well, maybe we'll just wait and see. It was a way of thumbing their nose at the president and his leadership in foreign affairs. I don't think the division is driven by foreign affairs, but it certainly affects foreign affairs in ways that are deeply distressing to much of the rest of the world. The United States is still obviously a very powerful country. I will say only this, and something we ought to know. There's a dirty little secret about American politics that I will share with you. We have a system of government in the United States that was designed not to work. It was designed 230-some years ago by people who hated strong government. Strong government was King George III of Britain. And they wanted to make it extremely difficult for the United States to be governed. In fact, the first constitution they wrote, you may know from your history, the Articles of Confederation, was so unworkable it had to be thrown out. States could raise tariffs on each other. It was ridiculous. So they threw it out, and then they wrote the current Constitution, which is filled with ways in which branches of government can stop things from happening. It's very easy to do. You've got two houses of Congress. You've got a division between the executive and the legislative and judicial branch. You have a federal system with 50 states that claim that they compete for power with the federal government. And a lot of those states are now run by Republicans who I believe are going to try to defy the health care law, even though it's the law of the land. They have said, and voters in many states have already passed laws saying the health care law shall be invalid in this state, like Missouri. That's going to come to a constitutional test. The dirty little secret is America was designed not to have effective government. We have no tradition that the British have that His Majesty's government must be carried on. In the United States, no, it must not be carried on. It must be stopped wherever possible. That's one dirty little secret. The other dirty little secret has more to do with foreign affairs. It does work, but it only works when there's a crisis. If there is a crisis, by which I mean an overwhelming sense of public urgency, suddenly the barriers fall away, suddenly problems get resolved, laws get passed, and things happen. That's how we got the economic stimulus bill. That's how we got the Patriot Act after 9/11. That's how we got most of the major legislation in the United States. There was an overwhelming sense of public urgency. In a crisis, we do very well. If there is a real world crisis, if there is a real challenge, something North Korea or whatever, America will hold together, and our government will work very effectively. But the problem is there's not always a crisis. My job at CNN was always to say what is and is not a real crisis. And it was often mystifying. Politicians in the United States, they know how this works. They go around the country declaring crises. There's an environmental crisis. There's an education crisis. There's a crisis of debt. There's a crisis of this or that. Or they'll declare war on something. We had a war on crime. We had a war on drugs. We had a war on poverty. Senator Moynihan once said, the late senator from New York, he once said, we declared war on poverty and poverty won. This is a way of trying to declare that there's a crisis. But you have to know when the crisis is real. What I can tell you right now is there is a crisis, and it's real. And it's not foreign affairs. It is a crisis of jobs. Because joblessness in the United States, like inflation here in Germany, joblessness is a real crisis. When Americans are jobless, they lose their health insurance. There is no safety net like as deep as there is here in Germany or in other countries in Europe. And of course, a job is central to the American dream. So it creates a terrible crisis in the United States. And unless the administration and the Congress do something about joblessness, I don't think it's going to be easy for any of them to get reelected. I'll tell you what's not a crisis, but people often think it is. Unfortunately, the national debt. In Europe, you have a regime of austerity. Certainly in Britain. There's some protests and some violence, but the British government, the new British government, appears to be able to deal with it. So can the French, which is a big surprise because rioting usually creates the end of governments in France, but this one seems to be sustained. In the United States, austerity is very difficult to sell. If you raise taxes, your head will get chopped off. If you make major cuts in important spending programs, you will be in very, very deep trouble. Austerity is a very difficult thing to sell in the United States. And one of the problems is that right now, only 4% of Americans consider the deficit a serious issue that Congress must address. It's been an issue for 20 years, more than that, 30 years, ever since Ronald Reagan cut taxes in 1981. George W. Bush did the same thing. We've had a terrible deficit problem. And every time a politician has tried to deal with it, like the first President Bush who raised taxes, that was the end of him. Bill Clinton raised taxes and he lost control of Congress. You can't cut spending, you can't raise taxes because it's not a real crisis and no one knows how to turn it into a real crisis. Another issue, sadly, hasn't reached the dimension of a crisis is climate change. The rest of the world is always mystified. Why don't Americans take climate change that seriously? The president has committed himself to doing something about it. Al Gore has won the Nobel Peace Prize. But the fact is, to Americans, they acknowledge that climate change is a problem. They think it's real and probably is human-caused. But it hasn't yet become a crisis where the people say, this is urgent. If you don't do something about it, you're going to be It is on. All right, thank you. Those are two dirty little secrets. It's not supposed to work, but it does work, but it only works in a crisis. And that's in foreign affairs or anything else. You give us a crisis, we'll do very well. Yes, ma'am.
Can you hear me? Okay,
Yes.
Hi. My name is Anishka Perlman, freelance writer for NPR. I was wondering, I have two questions for you. One is, you mentioned the perception of Obama as being elitist and progressive, but not populist, and that's part of the reason he doesn't have the whole country behind him after the initial momentum. What, in your opinion, has he not done that could have been done, if anything, to help the joblessness, since that's such a big indicator? That's the first question I have. And the second question I have is, now that the seats in the House of Representatives, that's a slip, has been shuffled around and they've got more seats and they've got a new speaker, what can they gridlock, if anything, in his initial platform? And what do you think might happen, and are his hands tied?
Or whose hands tied?
Obama's and the administration.
McBain.
For instance, you mentioned they cannot close Guantanamo now, it won't be closed. What about, his policies on sustainability and so other issues that he was pushing for?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Let me answer the second question first. It'll be difficult for him, clearly. There are some issues on which he does agree with the Republican Congress, probably on education reform. On trade, he and the Republicans probably see eye to eye, and that's not a populist issue. The populist position is more protectionist. But he agrees with the Republican Congress on some trade issues. On other issues, I think he will try to make a deal. He tried to make a deal with Republicans on health care. Remember, he had a conference and Republicans were there, but they weren't much interested. And he claims you can't make a deal with someone who's unwilling to deal with you. The Tea Party is only a minority of Republicans. They have about 30 members of the House of Representatives in a caucus that's, about 250 or 260. But they have terrified the Republican leadership because they've shown they can win primaries. So you find a lot of moderate Republicans who are very reluctant to reach out to Democrats and to want to make deals. That's trouble, and I think it will be very difficult on a lot of President Obama's agenda. I think he will make an effort. it'll be very interesting to see how the Republicans respond to the effort. I can't be dramatically optimistic, but I think on some issues there will be some headway. And also, Republicans remember the lessons of 1995 under Newt Gingrich. They were obstructionist for a year, and it was disastrous for Republicans, absolutely disastrous. I think there is a lot of concern. A lot of Tea Party people don't remember that, and they've said, if we shut the federal government down, it'll stay shut down, they have promised. Well, I really don't believe that if it's doing them incredible political damage, as it was doing under the Gingrich years. What could Obama have done about unemployment? Well, I think two things. One was public relations. He could have done the sort of thing that Bill Clinton did when he became president, and he said, I'm going to focus like a laser beam on the problem of joblessness in the country, and he appeared to give it tremendous attention for at least the first part of his presidency. President Obama passed the economic stimulus plan and then went on to other things like health care, which is obviously very important and a long-standing commitment on the Democratic Party, but the view of a lot of people was he had too big and too broad an agenda. He himself said at his news conference earlier this month, if unemployment were at 5% right now, I think all of our policies would look a lot better to people. And that's true. That's important. What could he have done in terms of policy? It's very unclear. But a lot of economists have argued, and I think there's some support for this, that the economic stimulus plan that was passed and was huge by, according to critics, $787 billion, was simply not big enough. That it could have been bigger, and it should have been bigger. The problem was bigger. The financial catastrophe was monumental. The fact is, the Congressional Budget Office, which is nonpartisan, has reported that the stimulus plan actually worked. It ended the recession, which is technically over, though most Americans don't believe it's over. It did end the recession. The economy is growing. It's just growing very slowly. And it probably saved somewhere like 3 million jobs. It did work, but Americans don't believe it worked because we lost about 8.5 million jobs, and they're not back. So people don't believe it worked, and therefore they say they don't want any more stimulus spending because why would we want to throw good money after bad? I think one of the points that is often made, and I think there's a lot of truth to it, is he did the right things, but his plan wasn't big enough. It wasn't big enough. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. My name is Shahid Riaz from Pak German Council for Culture and Democracy, Pakistan German Council. You did mention Afghanistan. You might know that Germany is under high security alert. We are waiting for few terrorists. Before invading Afghanistan, there was no threat to Germany. There was no high alert. You know that there will be a terrorist attack in Berlin. But after invading Afghanistan, NATO, now we are under a high security alert here. You mentioned that President Obama promised in the election campaign that he will withdraw from Afghanistan. He will. NATO decided in 2014. What will be the impact in next coming American elections and the whole world security if now America just take back his forces without any progress, which is not to be seen? I mean, how Americans feel like, because the situation, at least for the Germany, has worsened after invading Afghanistan, and leaving Afghanistan like this will be having more and more high security alerts back in Europe and America.
Well, I would simply point out one difference that we might have. The security alerts, the terrorism threat, that wasn't generated by the invasion of Afghanistan. That started with 9/11/2001. It started with the invasion of the United States by terrorist forces, with the loss of 3,000 lives, not all of them Americans. That's where the threat of terrorism started. And the invasion of Afghanistan, which the world supported, the problem with that was that we invaded Afghanistan in October of 2001. The whole world supported that invasion. We overthrew the Taliban by early December 2001, and most people thought the war was over. And for the next 5 years, the foreign policy agenda focused on Iraq, which is a deeply controversial war. Then when Obama became president and the Iraq war disappeared from the agenda by 2008. And now suddenly Americans look at the war in Afghanistan and they say, where did that war come from? And it's not entirely clear because it happened so many years ago. It's almost 10 years ago that invasion, and people thought that war was over. So there is a question about that. And there's one other thing. The president promised to begin the withdrawal of American forces in July 2011, not to complete it. Right now he says he hopes it can be completed by 2014, but that's not quite the ironclad commitment. So just like Iraq, I think American forces will stay in Afghanistan for a period of time. Whether they'll have a combat role, they no longer have a combat role in Iraq. The combat role will probably be greatly reduced, and I'm not sure whatever happens will be seen as a military victory. It's hard to see what that means in Afghanistan. But the important political commitment is that the president has promised to begin the withdrawal of American troops in July of next year, and I think that he will be held to that commitment. But that doesn't mean it will be completed quickly. There will be American forces in Afghanistan, which is still a very dangerous part of the world and represents a threat not only in the Middle East but also here in Europe. Yes, sir.
Yes, my name is Carlos Santos. I'm the ambassador of Mozambique here in Germany. Again, thank you very much for an excellent presentation, and we thank ICD, Aspen Institute, and Coca-Cola for bringing you here. My question is related to the relations between the United States and China, and the politics of it and the economics of it. Is there any impact of this relationship in the internal politics of the United States? Because it has been said that some of the money for the stimulus package came from China. I don't know if this is true or not, but I wanted your views on that.
Americans are perfectly aware of that a lot of our government debt is financed by China. We know that. China was a bit of an issue in the election. Many candidates, mostly conservatives, Republicans, ran ads demonizing China as a looming threat to the United States. It was a way of attacking the Democrats for failing to manage the economy and empowering China. The American views of China, and that was the only foreign policy issue that surfaced at all in the election campaign. Iraq, Afghanistan just didn't exist. China did. Americans have always had a very mixed view of China. Partly admiring because they see the Chinese people, the Chinese economic system as corrupt, not as less corrupt than other countries, as efficient, as fast-growing. In a way, Americans feel outcompeted, which is a problem. But so far, at least, there's not a sense of military threat from China, even though it's a communist country. It's not what the Soviet Union was during the Cold War. The threat from China is entirely economic. And Americans do worry about it. Again, it's not a military situation, but they see China as a friend on some issues, a competitor on economic issues. In some ways, perhaps an adversary, but not the kind of deep existential threat that the Soviet Union posed during the Cold War. I'm not sure it's going to get worse. Depends on what the Chinese do and what happens to the American economy. You know, if the American economy gets better, which everyone hopes, everything will look better in the world. The president will look popular, things will change, and people will have a much better outlook. Let me just remind you of something interesting. I started in television in 1991, and for the first decade when I was on CNN, it was impossible to cover world affairs to an American audience. I worked for CNN Domestic. It was very difficult. No one was interested. The 1990s in the United States was what I call the fantasy decade. It was an interwar period exactly like the 1920s in the United States, and for that matter here in Weimar, Germany. The Cold War ended on December 25th, 1991, when President George H.W. Bush went on television on Christmas night and said something that 10 presidents before him could only dream of saying: "My fellow Americans, the Soviet Union is no more." And then he quickly changed the subject to the American economy, which was in recession, because Americans didn't care. Their view of the Soviet collapse was, wonderful, you've overthrown a brutal and corrupt dictatorship after 70-some years. Congratulations, have a nice day. Please don't ask us for any money, we don't have any. Ted Turner, the head of CNN, the founder of CNN, was so bothered by the absence of any American triumphalism over our victory in the Cold War that he spent $100 million and made, I think, a 26-hour series on the history of the Cold War that showed all over the world. You can purchase it. Because he said, you know, we've just fought this war for over 40 years, and somebody should take notice that we won. Hello. You know, the wall came down. But Americans were preoccupied. And then, you know, that was December 25th, 1991. And then, of course, we jump forward to September 11th, 2001, when the war on terror began. In between, there was 10 years. In those 10 years, Americans paid no attention to the rest of the world. It was sad. It was tragic, because things were happening. Remember, the World Trade Center was bombed first in 1993, and it was treated not as an act of war, but as a crime, and the perpetrator is in prison right now. People were killed, not nearly as many, of course, but it was not seen as an existential threat to the United States in 1993 when the Trade Center was bombed. We had attacks on Americans overseas, Khobar Barracks, the USS Cole. There were many terrorist attacks. And Bill Clinton, as president, did his very best to try to warn Americans that there was a threat out there. And they didn't pay a great deal of attention. If you remember when he attacked what he thought were terrorist bases in Afghanistan and Iran and Sudan, people thought he was, the phrase was wagging the dog, trying to get attention away from his problems over Monica Lewinsky. People just, it was impossible even for the president to dramatize that there really was a threat to the United States in the world. It was exactly like the 1920s. People were making a lot of money, and we were preoccupied with ridiculous stories. We spent over a year covering the O.J. Simpson trial, and then we spent a year covering Monica Lewinsky, and we had Elian Gonzalez, remember that? The young child from Cuba. And we had all kinds, some terrible tragedies. We had the Oklahoma City bombing. We had the Columbine school shootings. We had the tragic death of Princess Diana and John Kennedy Jr. But all of these stories, more or less tabloid stories, all of these stories totally preoccupied the news media, and the rest of the world, from the United States point of view, became very, very far away. That's something Americans will do. We love to ignore the world. You know, good luck to you, you know, just don't get us involved. If we have to become involved, we will. And that's what happened on September 11th, 2001. And of course, now there's a much more serious threat. That interwar period, that fantasy decade of the 1990s, was odd because a president like Bill Clinton didn't have to have military credentials. Usually, during the Cold War, it was crucial for a president to have military experience to be elected president, and they all did. Clinton had no military experience, and remember the controversy over his draft record during the Vietnam era. But it didn't really make any difference because, God bless them, Americans really honestly believed that no one threatened us. That wasn't true, and the president tried to say, yes, they do. But they honestly believed that. That was an odd and very strange decade in American life and in the history of the world. And we hope it never happens again. But there is always this proclivity of Americans to pay very little attention to anything in the rest of the world. Any other question? Any other answers? Yes, ma'am. Yes, this is the final question, I am told.
My name is Olivia Scheller. I'm from the newspaper Berliner Zeitung. And I have a question concerning foreign policy. You said it doesn't play really a role right now. Americans are not interested. But is there sort of a disappointment of what President Obama has achieved worldwide? Let's say in the Middle East peace, it's completely dead. He tried to open up to Iran. There's no response. Is there a feeling that the United States has kind of lost its way with the world as a peacemaking power or having influence in the world?
I think that overstates it. I think The problem is Americans don't see any major achievement of President Obama on the world stage. He won the Nobel Peace Prize, which I dare say was a bit premature. But they don't see any President Carter was a failure as president, but he had the Camp David peace process. I wouldn't say the Middle East peace process is dead. It's as it has been for decades, limping along without any prospect of a real resolution. And in the world, his recent trip to Asia was not a brilliant success. I think people are reserving judgment. Americans continue to admire President Obama. They like his outreach to the Muslim world. That's not unpopular in the United States. But they just haven't seen any results. Americans judge every policy by results. And they haven't seen any results of his outreach to the rest of the world. There is one issue which is as much domestic as foreign, and I would put it this way. Machiavelli, a great philosopher, wrote 500 years ago, "It is more important for a prince to be feared than to be loved." He said it's actually good to be both, but he said if you have to make a choice, it's more important to be feared than to be loved. One thing that Obama has not done yet is establish what I call the fear factor. Every president has to do it. He has to make it clear that if you defy him, you will pay a price, that he is not someone to be trifled with. Harry Truman did it when he fired General MacArthur for insubordination during the Korean War. John Kennedy did it before the Cuban Missile Crisis, an incident most Americans don't remember, but he confronted the United States steel industry when it tried to raise prices, which would have been deeply inflationary. And he had a press conference in which he dared steel companies to raise prices, and they backed down. And it was a heroic victory for President Kennedy, of course, followed the next year by the Cuban Missile Crisis when he stood down the Soviet Union. President Reagan created the fear factor very early in his presidency when he confronted the Air Traffic Controllers Union strike, which threatened to cripple the airline industry. He just fired the air traffic controllers, hired new ones, and it showed his authority. He established himself as someone not to be trifled with. Every president has to do that. Bill Clinton did it. It took him a while, but he did it in his third year of presidency when he confronted the Republican Congress and Newt Gingrich over the government shutdown, and he won. One problem President Obama has is he hasn't established that yet. Every president has to do it. He has to establish what I call the fear factor, that if you defy him, you will pay a price. Truman, the great Democratic presidents have all done that. Truman did that. John Kennedy, of course, did that in his presidency. Lyndon Johnson, well, I'd put it this way. If you defied John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy would see to it that you paid a price. If you defied Lyndon Johnson, you probably wake up in the morning missing an important body part. That's essential. It's absolutely crucial for any president. Obama just hasn't done it yet. The closest he came was an incident no one remembers. Anyone remember the Somali pirates? That was an interesting incident, but he negotiated that very well and ended up winning. But it was a very small incident. And I don't think he established it really when he fired General McChrystal, the commanding general in Afghanistan, because it looked like he was backed into that by General McChrystal having said, his staff having said many embarrassing remarks. So I don't think it has happened yet. There's still time, and he can still do it. But his problem in the country as well as in the world is he really hasn't established his authority yet as president, and it's something I believe he urgently has to do. One more question.
Well, here.
One.
Thomas Pieper from Berlin. Where he could establish this fear factor, on which field?
Oh, I don't know.
Any
He
idea?
can do it domestically. He can do it in foreign affairs. President Kennedy did it first with the steel industry on a domestic issue, and then in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Reagan did it first in the air traffic controller strike, which is a domestic issue. Later, he came here to Berlin and said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." And he did. People scoffed when he said that, but he did. It was the continuation of John Kennedy saying, "Ich bin ein Berliner." It could be domestic, it could be foreign. No one knows. Opportunities present themselves, crises, opportunities at every juncture. One time when he did not do it, and this was, I think, damaging, the oil spill last summer. The oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. I don't know that there's anything Obama could have done about it. But in the oil spill, it was a difficult problem for him because the television networks, all of them, were showing oil gushing. I mean, they had this wonderful technology. They could show the oil spilling into the Gulf and the terrible environmental problems that this was creating. And it was outrageous. And Americans were saying, is no one in control? Can no one do anything about this? And it went on month after month until it finally was put under control. People, of course, blamed the oil company, and so did the president. But that's not a good thing for the president to do, to say, you know, it's someone else's fault. I demand that they handle this. People in the United States, and I dare say anywhere else in the world, they want to believe that their leader is in control of events. Here's another little secret. The President of the United States is not in control of events. Very often, nobody is in control of events. But the voters need to believe that someone is in control of events. And I wrote at the time that the President looked a bit like Jimmy Carter did during the Iranian hostage crisis, as if it went on month after month after month. America held hostage day 200, day 300, and he couldn't do anything. It's very, very dispiriting for people to see any leader who doesn't seem to be able to control events. And that is damaging. I mean, the best example of a leader who wasn't in control but who appeared to be was Rudy Giuliani after 9/11, when he took to the streets of New York and he had 4 press conferences a day and he was covered in ashes and he looked like he was working his heart out. He wasn't in control of that, but he created the impression that he was. And in a democracy, that is very, very important.
Could you imagine that climate change could become such a field?
I thought it would after Katrina. I thought maybe this is the issue that will create the crisis of climate change that will finally enable the United States to do something about it. I thought it would after the tsunami tragedy in 2004. There are many instances of environmental degradation that I thought would finally bring home to Americans that this is a crisis that we must deal with. So far, that really hasn't happened. It hasn't reached the dimensions of a serious crisis that's confronting Americans in their face. And until that happens, and this is just the problem of the way our politics works, it's going to be very difficult for us to deal with it. Obama is serious about it. He's going to do what he can by executive order because he's unlikely to get any legislation through the new Congress, and he is committed to doing something. But what's happened is the issue of climate change has now, more than ever in the past, become a partisan issue in the United States and part of the polarization in American politics. Until the environmental crisis reaches a proportion where Americans say, do something or else, I don't think that it's likely that any major policy breakthroughs will happen. That's very sad, but that is part of the problem we have making our politics work. We don't anticipate problems. We deal with crises.
Doctor, thank you.